I've been getting over a cold, so I've got the Robitussin in the one hand, water in the other. So you'll just have to bear with me if I start just vanishing into a coughing fit. So I was never actually thought I would be a biologist. I grew up with a physicist's father, learned a lot of physics and astrophysics and so on, and actually figured at that time I would grow up to be something like that. And then went off to college, studied physics, and decided I didn't really want to do that. And then moved over into mathematics, which I liked more. But by the time I left, I decided actually I didn't really want to do anything academic at all. And then wandered off in a number of different jobs for a number of years, including actually teaching kindergarten and things of that sort. And then actually came back into biology, more or less actually on a dare with a friend of mine. We each chose a random letter from the alphabet and said we had to go to graduate school in it. And I chose B for biology and he chose E for education. It actually worked out really well. He's an education professor, I'm a biology professor. So, you know, if you have graduate students and they're thinking about, you know, how to choose what to do next, I mean, it's actually not so bad. Also was very interested in the visual arts. And so because of this background in math and physics and the visual arts, I've been really attracted to the issues in biology that center around optics, vision, light, camouflage, signaling, bioluminescence, and so on. Just to sort of give you sort of a sampling of some of the different critters and things we've worked on. We look at transparent animals, pigmented animals, animals with really unusual eye systems, like over here, giant squid because of their giant eyes, animals with flashlights, animals that light up their entire bodies to hide, animals with living Bragg stacks that can change reflectance on the order of a few seconds, sort of a whole host of different things. And because of this, we really also sort of work in a lot of different habitats and using a lot of different techniques, ranging all the way from molecular biophysics to various kinds of mathematical optical modeling, X-ray diffraction, a lot of open ocean field work where we do submersibles, go down to submersibles, we go down to scuba diving open ocean, put a lot of optical gadgets into the ocean to do environmental measurements, different homebrew spectrophotometric techniques, polarization techniques, and so on. It's been a great deal of fun, and I'm always getting to learn something new. So it's biology is just sort of an endless source of questions. And so if you have some techniques to bring to that questions, you can keep yourself happy your entire life. So before I get into sort of the actual things I wanted to talk about, I just wanted to hit on a few sort of philosophical things. And one is that at least from a biological perspective, I'm a mathematical biologist. Most of the math I'm going to show you today is actually fairly simple. But I always think of it as something, you know, rather foreign. And to me, I say, you know, that's not really the issue. The real issue when you try to marry math and physics to biology is that you're talking about two completely different kingdoms of thought. You know, at the extremes, you know, chemistry and physics work pretty well together, biology and chemistry work pretty well together. But when you start pulling like physics and biology together, it's really quite challenging. And the big trick is finding something that you can actually make work where you deal with sort of, you know, the wonderful sort of mathematical purity of physics and then apply it to the incredible messiness of biology. So suppose, for example, you want to know the electromagnetic properties of a cow. There are people that really want to know this, believe it or not. So you could take, you know, what's actually an old joke, assume a spherical cow. You'll get a wonderful, you know, closed form solution of the electromagnetic field inside and outside of this cow. But it's not going to tell you a great deal about the actual cow you have on hand. Or you can take what's considered more stereotypical biological approach. You get about 5 cows, and you measure every single thing on this and create an extremely complicated model that has no analytical solution, and even a number crunching solution eventually gives you an answer, but it's not an answer that provides a great deal of insight. It's got too much specificity, and so in one case you got too much generality, and the other too much specificity. And in this case, you may get answers, but they might only really apply to the few cows that you actually had in the lab, and it's not going to help you much. So what you really want is something in between. Believe it or not, this is an electromagnetic model of a cow that you can use. If there's a radio transmitter inside the cow, it will tell you everything about the field outside to the level of precision that you really need for cows. And you can, believe it or not, buy this on the internet for $10,000. People buy it. So the other sort of philosophical issue is that For the kind of work I do, mostly I work on the open ocean. A lot of it's deep sea, but in general, it's very far from land. And the real challenge is that even with extremely good imaging techniques, gadgets, lots of money and so on, it's almost impossible to get undisturbed observations of behavior. We can't actually see what the animals are doing for a number of reasons. One of which is that it's very expensive just to get out on the ocean in the first place. You need a ship that's about 200 to 300 feet long. It costs anywhere from $25,000 a day to about $75,000 a day, whether anything works on it or not. It only goes about 11 miles an hour. And so, while you're spending this tremendous amount of money, you're not going very far. And then to actually get any information going down through the water is very difficult because the depths are large enough that almost nothing optically will penetrate it. Sonar only gives you so much information, and so on and so on. So for the longest time, most of what we knew about what was in the ocean was done by dragging a net behind a boat. You get a big metal line, you get a net, just like commercial fishermen, you drag it along, and then you throw everything in a bucket. And so if you want to imagine how useful this really is, think about if at this moment, that wall opened up and an enormous bulldozer came in and scooped all of you up and then just started pushing you down, let's say, Forbes Avenue all the way towards downtown. And during this process, you're screaming, you're yelling. Some of you are having limbs sheared off by the bulldozer. The more aggressive of you are actually actively eating the less aggressive to have sort of that much more time to live. And then you're dumped in a big pile, somewhere in downtown, and a group of anthropologists show up. And they try to figure out, who is sitting next to who is ready to mate, who is not ready to mate, who has had a good day, who's had a bad day. This is sort of the state of oceanography for a long time. It just doesn't, work very well. And a friend of mine at Woods Hole once said it's like dragging a grappling hook over London and trying to understand why the English are the way they are. It just doesn't get you anywhere. And indeed, this is what you get. You're going to see a lot of pretty pictures in this talk. This is not one of them. This shows you what you see when you actually look in a trawl bucket. The animals tend to either be dead or moribund, or they're cut into different parts. And in fact, for many years, for decades, a lot of animals that were described as two different species were in fact two halves of the same animal. So it'd be as which after you're all dumped in downtown, people decide there are leg humans and torso humans, without ever actually seeing either alive, and then years later go, oh, these two things stick together. Works out really well. So not great. About 30, 40 years ago, things started to improve. Near the surface, we started doing open ocean scuba diving, which is just like scuba diving near the shore on a coral reef, except for the fact that the water is 10,000 feet deep. And so if you drop anything, it's really not coming back. We're hooked into a whole trapeze system that's generally home built, and that makes sure that none of us drift away, never to be seen again. And particularly that we don't blow our depth profiles, because the water is so clear that you can sink about 200 meters and it doesn't get that much darker. You will actually adapt as you go down, but by that point at 200 meters, you will not live if you come back to the surface. And so we're all tied in. The person right here, his job is to keep the lines from being tangled and to look out for sharks. Sharks on a coral reef are pretty nice because you're essentially swimming in the refrigerator and they're not interested in you. But in the open ocean, where there's much less food, if they show up, they're actually much more interested in eating it. So we need somebody to look out for sharks. This only gets you about the top 100 feet or so. And still, you're not getting undisturbed observations of behavior because you're showing up as a strange new collection of black-suited things just sort of floating in the middle of the water. Nobody's going to act normal with that. But we do try to go deeper. This is the Johnson Sea Link submersible. Wonderful thing. It'll get you down to about 1,000 meters. But again, it's not going to give you undisturbed observations of behavior. This thing is about the size of a small school bus. It's got about 20 big propellers, huge electromagnetic signature, and worst of all, it's covered in floodlights that, because the dynamic range in the ocean is so little, the eyes have almost no dynamic range, will actually permanently blind anything that they look at. And so another way to think of this is imagine you're driving down the road in a school bus full of screaming children. The windows are open, they're actually leaning out and screaming, the horns are the horns are blaring, the lights are flashing. They come across, these two little bunnies on the side of the road mating. And then the expectation is that, oh, well, they'll just keep doing it. Like, no, right? 100 yards before the bus ever showed up, they're all gone. And this would seem obvious, in retrospect, right? But a good example of how people haven't considered this is there's this fish called the parallelepiped, little shiny fish about this long, kind of narrow. Every time we see it from a submersible, it's vertical with its eyes down and its tail up. And people have written entire papers on how this fish feeds, how it lives an entire life being standing on its head. Until later on, we put down infrared camera arrays on tripods and noticed that they swim perfectly normally. And so what we're actually seeing when we show up with a submersible are basically expressions of stark terror. And in many cases followed by permanent blindness. So it's got some real problems. So we have to, in many cases, do what we call forensic biology, where we gather information about the animals we bring up. We try to get what limited behavior we can get in the lab on the ship. We do measurements of their visual physiology, measurements of their optical properties, their bioluminescence. We send other equipment down that measures the optical environment, how much light at different wavelengths, and some of it also has to be modeled because the measurements are too difficult. And then we piece together what we think is actually going on, even though we never get to see it. So an example of this here is, imagine you come upon a little sort of funny animal with like big sharp teeth near some wood that's been chewed through. You do some thinking, and you come to the conclusion that this thing chews on wood. You'd love to actually see it chew on the wood, and in the case of a beaver, you actually can with some nice little cameras and so on. But in the ocean, sometimes we never do. And this is sort of the state of the field. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories. Our lab works really, we're sort of a random, chaotic collective. My grad students are able to work on whatever projects they want, which keeps me on my toes, and has meant that we've worked on just dozens of different things. And so I'm only going to talk about 3 of them. I'm going to be talking about what we call colorful, colorblind animals, polarization, vision, and camouflage, and visual costs of schooling. Okay, so first, the colorful, colorblind animals. This is in collaboration with Tammy Frank down in Florida, an old friend of mine and colleague, and one of my graduate students, Eleanor Caves. So cleaner shrimp are wonderful animals. They're incredibly beautiful, colorful. They also have big transparent parts that we use for a lot of biophotonics studies, trying to figure out how they're as transparent as they are. It turns out in many ways they do it because they're eternally holding their breath, which is part of a sort of another talk. But what they're famous for is cleaning. They will sit on an anemone, usually groups of about 2 to 5, and when a fish shows up, they'll start waving their antennae in a very stereotypical way, saying, fish, I'm here, fish, I'm here, fish, I'm here, I'd like to clean you. The fish literally drives up like it's a car wash, sits down on the bottom of the ground, and then the cleaner shrimp will come out and then pull open the mouth, pull open the gills, and just start cleaning all over. And what they're doing is they're cleaning parasites off the body. And then the next fish will come in line after that one leaves, and the next one and next one. There's this whole 2-way communication process that we have no idea how it evolved, but it did. And then this fish, once it's done, will go to the back of the line. And so these fish spend their entire day being cleaned if they're in an area with a cleaner station. So it's sort of like endlessly going to the hairdresser. But they're very colorful. And the question has always been, why are they so colorful? They have all these beautiful spots. And the assumption has always been that these animals are looking at each other. They're seeing these beautiful spots, they're getting up close, and anytime you see a very colorful animal in nature, the usual idea is that they're doing it to show off to a potential mate, or they're doing it to show off to somebody of the same sex that, I'm better than you and I'm going to kill you if we get into a fight. Those are sort of like the 2 reasons to be pretty and colorful, is either to get a mate or kill a rival. And so that was always the assumption with these guys, but that's assuming that they can actually see them. And one thing that we as humans sort of have a really privileged spot is in our amazing spatial acuity. More or less like 90% of animals, even ones with like what seem like good eyes and so on, are more or less legally blind by our standards, meaning that they have vision that's 2200 or worse. Even with animals with eyes, the range of acuity is about 4 orders of magnitude, starting with us and the eagles at the top, and then just continually going down to animals that have a minimum resolvable angles of about 45 degrees, which is, pretty sorry. And so what things look like to them is very different from what they look like to us. And just as one little example here, these are nice little deep sea crab. It's called a galatheid. And people always say, oh, well, there's this orange crab on this coral, sticks out like a sore thumb. First, if you account for, its actual monochromatic vision and the blue light down there, you can see that it actually blends in pretty well. And then if you account for the visual resolution of the average animal that would want to eat it at that depth, you can see that, it's actually camouflaged very well indeed. And this is actually from quite a short distance, only about like 10, 15 centimeters away. So we worked on 3 different cleaner shrimp, 3 very colorful, beautiful ones from different parts of mostly the Caribbean. And then we needed to figure out, first of all, their color vision. They're such colorful animals. Shrimp usually have, wonderful color vision, in fact, better than ours. And so then what we do, and this is a technique that's related to things that people do in this audience, but different, is that we needed to essentially characterize the camera. Where you're trying to figure out, the spectral sensitivities of your different color channels, and, either you call the company or you do it yourself. Here we do it using neurophysiological techniques, which in this case means we take a little shrimp, we sort of put it in a little spot, and then we have a monochromator that cycles through a whole range of wavelengths, and then flashlights one after another at the face of this animal. And then because all the photoreceptors are flashing at once, in response to this with a neural signal, the signal is strong enough that you can pick it up with actually a reasonably decent amplifier. It doesn't have to be amazing, and the electrode just has to be near the eye. It's that, sort of strong a signal. And then we can work out, roughly what is the sensitivity. And then we can do experiments where we try to hit them with a lot of light of one color versus another color and sort of bleach out if there were different cone classes doing different things. And the end result is, and you don't need to know all the details of this picture, but the end result of it is that these guys don't see color at all. They have these beautiful color patterns all over their entire bodies, but they have no ability at all to see any sort of color. For their world, it's entirely black and white. So the color part of these patterns is definitely not for them. But then the question is, well, maybe, it's, all the other sort of dots and stripes and so on, maybe those are for them. And so we did another set of experiments where we put these animals in a drum of black and white stripes. And then you rotate the drum so the stripes move, and then these animals, as most animals will do what's called an optomotor response, where their entire body will rotate to stabilize the field. This is very similar to if you go to an IMAX movie where they show a roller coaster ride and your body's sort of going around like that with it. You're trying to sort of stabilize your visual field. These animals do this. And so by making the stripes smaller and smaller and smaller, we can eventually figure out what level of acuity they can actually pick out, because at one point the stripes will be so small they won't do the optomotor response anymore. And we did it at different light levels, and then also compared it to the predicted minimum resolvable angle based on the morphology of the eye. These are compound eyes, and so their individual pixels have sort of a sampling limit. And what you find out is that the resolution is absolutely terrible. Predictions by morphology are minimum resolvable angles about 8 degrees or so. And then, under behavior, even under bright light, it's, in the range of like 10 in this case, about 9, again, about 8 or so. And then when you get to dimmer light, it's really bad. So, our minimum resolvable angle is somewhere around 1/100 of a degree. So much, much better. So this gives you an idea of what you're left with. You start with these beautiful, colorful animals, and these are all actually only being viewed from a distance of about 1 centimeter away. So very, very close in. Maybe it was 2 centimeters, I can't remember. First, you account for the fact that they have monochromatic vision and what that gives you, and then you account for the resolution. You find that even at these very, very short distances, they can barely pick out anything at all. There is more information because, of course, these things are moving, not static, and so there's some sort of binding going on as things move around. You can pick up more information. But essentially, definitely the information about the patterns themselves are completely lost. And so this shows, one way, I'm going to this talk sort of divided into 3 parts. One is about what animals can't do that we can do. The next is what they can do that we generally cannot. And then the third is about sort of how well they can do something that we can do fairly well. So getting to the second part, which is getting into things that these visual systems can do that we, at least our own eyes, cannot do, and this is polarization vision. This was done with Yakir Gagnon, Tom Cronin, and Justin Marshall, sort of scattered around the planet now. I've always liked this particular monument. It's a monument actually to Lewis Carroll Through the Looking Glass, and it does a good job of describing an actual mirror, even though it's made out of just a hunk of bronze. So one important thing to know about the ocean is that predation is absolutely severe. It's completely different from predation on land for a number of different reasons. One is that it's 3-dimensional, Where you're sitting here now, if you're worried about a predator, you probably would not be worried about the predator coming up from the floor and taking you out. None of you are looking down right now, like wondering if a tiger is down there about to jump out to the floor. And there's nowhere to hide, which is another issue. At the moment, like if a whole bunch of predators came through that door, you'd have a lot of options. You could duck behind the chairs, you could go into these different sound booths. You could do a lot of things that an animal on a coral reef or an animal land could do. But in the open ocean, your only hope is that you swim faster. And the general rule in the open ocean is that the things that swim faster are generally the predators, and so you have no hope there. So it's much more as if you're out on a big open field, let's say Flagstaff Hill or outside of Phipps Conservatory, and then somebody who runs a lot faster than you with a machete just starts running around. There's just not a lot of options. The third is that there's nothing really that's easy to disguise yourself as. If you're on a coral reef or somewhere else, you can pretend to be algae, you can pretend to be some complicated background, but in the ocean, you really have to pretend that you're water. You have to pretend that you're not there at all. And this is tricky. You're trying to do, an extremely challenging camouflage task. And so it's become, for us, a real natural laboratory in extreme adaptations. Because you have a situation where camouflage is absolutely critical, but its achievement is extremely difficult. And so you see a lot of things that you just don't see on land. The thing you do see on land, you see pigmentation, you see colors. Animals absorb light, send back, other wavelengths, and, do different patterns to match the background. You see that in all sorts of habitats. These three you only see in these open ocean water column habitats, where you see mirrors, which we're going to talk about, transparency, which we'll talk about, and lights, where you actually sort of hide your body by lighting it up so it matches the background light field. And so for us has been like a major thrust of our research is examining these different techniques, seeing how they work in different habitats, what their limitations are, how different physical principles are exploited, and then how animals have evolved different camouflage breaking visual techniques to get around this. So there's sort of this very interesting coevolutionary arms race going on. The two I want to talk about today, both in relation to polarization vision, are transparency and mirroring. Transparency is an obvious form of camouflage. You just sort of look straight through it. Tremendous number of animals there have it, and it's so good that an animal can be 10 inches in front of your face and be 2 feet long, and you might not be able to see it, except for the eyes. You can generally see the eyes because they have to absorb light to see. Mirroring is a little more subtle, and I'll get to that in a second. So these transparent animals, and there are a lot of them, like I said, they do a pretty good job of being clear. There's 3 of them here, and at the moment they're being looked at through parallel polarizers. So, you can see, nice and transparent. But here they are through cross polarizers. So one problem with these transparent animals is that they're highly birefringent. They have connective tissue, what we call tendon, things of that sort, and muscle, which are these long parallel fibers that are birefringent. And so because the underwater light field in the open ocean is actually quite polarized, 30 to 50%, sometimes even higher, and because an awful lot of animals in the open ocean have polarization vision, the hypothesis has been for a very long time that this birefringence is the reason that polarization is there, that the polarization vision of these predatory animals is being used as a camouflage breaker. And this hypothesis has been around a few decades or so. And so, if you're just sort of like imagining the scenario, you have a transparent animal, you have downward radiance, some of that is scattered horizontally, and then you have the horizontal radiance that's polarized and then sent through. The polarization is either changed, it's either lessened or it's rotated or so on, mixed in with the path light, and then this person who looks a great deal like Lenin takes a look at it, and in theory, if it has polarization vision with these polarization goggles on, can sort it out. So we first built a really nice underwater housing, a really nice camera, and this was done probably about 10 years ago. We had this pneumatic crystal that would rotate back and forth 90 degrees every frame. The whole thing together cost some appalling like $25,000 or something like that. And then at the same time, just for chuckles, we got 2 $500 cameras, put 2 little filters over them perpendicular, had it in a little frame so that we could push both buttons at the same time. Which system do you think worked better? The cheap one. And the problem was that because this thing went back and forth every 30th of a second, we had terrible issues with registration errors. Like I said, this is 10 years ago, and we didn't have a lot of the nifty software that I've seen, here at this conference where people are able to get rid of registration errors easily and so on. It turns out even these animals which are drifting and so on do just enough that you end up with enough registration error problems that's a real issue. And so this nice little cheapy thing ended up being the one we liked a lot because we could push the buttons at the same time. Seems all very simple, but you have to remember we're doing this in a boat hundreds of miles from shore, swimming around like a scuba tied to a bunch of lines, essentially capturing and like chasing these things to the current over and over and over. So it can be a real bear. And we expected to see all this sort of beautiful birefringence, which we did not. I'm not going to go belabor this picture too much. The main thing to see is that this is the polarization channel. There's a red, green, and blue channel. And what we got, instead of, we expected that this picture, which is sort of the white light image, when we looked at it under polarization, we would see the incredible birefringence that we saw when we looked at this thing in the lab. I mean, we did not. Essentially, all we got was that the areas that were white here showed up as very low polarization, and the areas that were, otherwise inside that were beautifully birefringent, the original lab photos would show up as birefringent, did not, no matter how we did it and how many different animals and so on. And this led me to have sort of a general maxim that is true in the visual biology world. Less important for you guys, but probably something to occasionally consider is never fall in love with your pretty pictures. We have the ability now to take incredibly wonderful controlled images under all sorts of modalities and under highly controlled lighting situations that allow us to see extremely high contrast examples of different optical phenomena. A nice example here from a long time ago is you have fluorescent rocks. They look really stunning here, but of course what's missing is the fact that you've got mostly excitation wavelength and then a beautiful, nice filter that's taking out all the other wavelengths so you can see the emission really well. Here you actually have the same excitation wavelength present here in the amounts that you would see under normal daylight with no filter at all, and you can see that even though they're fluorescing, you're not going to see it. Another example of this is we have a lot of animals in the open ocean. They're beautifully birefringent. You see nice little rainbows and all that, and there have been papers about what does this mean, what's the ecological purpose, and so on. But this only works under highly directed light fields, and the light field in the ocean tends to be very diffuse, and so this is the same species, even pretty close to the surface, and you can see that you don't see the birefringence at all. And so the take-home message, particularly for biologists, is that if you ever want to understand anything about the optical properties of an animal, make sure that you actually see those optical properties in the correct lighting environment, rather than the beautiful images you can make in a lab. And it's one of these things I'm always pounding home, but people generally don't listen. So we're thinking about, why aren't we seeing this birefringence? We didn't have the ability at that time to measure the light field at all wavelengths in all directions, azimuths, elevations, and so on. But because it's an open ocean light field, it tends to be fairly easily modelable because most of it's determined by water with just a tiny bit of chlorophyll. And so we did have nice measurements of the inherent optical properties, the absorption coefficient, scattering coefficient, volume scattering function. And then we'd use it using these nice little profiling gadgets. And then we just essentially put it into some semi-commercial radiative transfer software, takes the inherent optical properties and the boundary conditions, and then essentially solves a radiative transfer equation, and gives you the apparent optical properties, the radiance at different wavelengths, at different directions, at different depths, and so on. Really nice piece of software, but there's a side reaction where a lot of your money goes away. The software costs about $10,000. However, for this money, you get a t-shirt, in addition to the software itself, with the radiative transfer equation on it. So you can go to ocean optics conferences and you'll see the other two people in the world that bought this software and they're walking around with this t-shirt saying, I had $10,000 to spend to buy, something that solved the radiative transfer equation for me. In doing this, the end result that you get for the particular water we were looking at was that the downward radiance, the light coming down that could be scattered horizontally, was far, far higher than the horizontal radiance, much more than we originally anticipated. And in fact, if you look at the ratio of the two, for the wavelengths we care about mostly, which is the sort of blue range where most of the light is, it's roughly, 100-fold near the surface and still, 40 to 50-fold or so. It's quite a bit. So the real situation is that you have a great deal more downward radiance relative to horizontal background radiance than you originally thought. even if only a small fraction of this is scattered horizontally, this is the part, those white things, and that scattering is depolarizing, and so that's why you see low polarization for that part. But the part coming through that, would have shown up the birefringence actually is more or less overwhelmed by this downward radiance of the light being scattered horizontally, because even they scatter only a few percent, but it's enough for the fact because this is so much more than what's coming here. And so you end up with the fact that, this birefringence you see in the lab under perfect transmitted light conditions just isn't really showing up in other situations. So moving now to mirrors. Lots and lots of mirrored animals in the ocean. And it turns out that the real reason for this is camouflage. Even though a mirrored animal, when you see it on the deck of a ship, or when, let's say, you look at sardines in a can, they look beautiful and shiny and stick out like sore thumbs. In the ocean, they do a beautiful job of hiding. This is a nice little vertical mirror in the ocean. You can see it actually does a pretty good job. Front stuck a cute little jellyfish there just so you can see the edge of it. And the reason for this is that the underwater light field is fairly symmetrical about the vertical axis. So if you have an oceanic predator here, in this case my wife, and then you have the light coming down, and then imagine, even though the animal, you're looking at a cross-section of a fish here, even though the animal has a curved body, imagine that the mirrors are all vertical just for the moment. And so then, because of the cylindrical symmetry about the vertical axis, she's looking at a spot of water right here, which is just the same as the spot of water as if she was looking directly through the animal. So it really is sort of a trick with light and mirrors, in that she's not looking at what she thinks she's looking at, and the camouflage actually goes quite well. This verticality of the mirrors was examined by Eric Denton at the Plymouth Marine Lab a number of years ago, and he found that, yes, many of these animals, actually most of them, even though they have curved bodies, you're looking at sort of like a salmon steak here. The red lines here are the actual mirrors. You can see that they have different angles relative to the skin, but they're trying to maintain a relatively vertical mirror the whole way through, showing you that, evolution is sort of one of the cleverer biophotonics engineers out there. The things they come up with are truly remarkable. But dielectric mirrors, just like water, change the polarization of light. And so again, for a very long time, there was a hypothesis that these mirrors, this mirror camouflage, could be broken by animals with polarization vision, because they could pick up this change in the polarization as the light reflected from it. So we got an even better camera. A number of years have gone by, and Victor Gruev at Washington University was starting to use some of these nice little fabrication techniques to make the cameras that have, tiny little filters over every single pixel, so that you can extract the Stokes vectors and eventually pull out the angle of polarization, the degree of polarization, and so on. This actually worked really, really well. Most of this work was done either in the Bahamas or on the Great Barrier Reef. And we end up, just as an example image here, you can have the radiance, just a normal image, and then the degree of linear polarization. Turns out there's not much circular polarization in the ocean. And then in this case, the angle of polarization. But this can't tell you really what the animal is seeing. Again, this is sort of artificial, just like that other one I showed you. You're working in two completely different modalities, polarization vision versus normal radiance vision. And so you need a way to actually know how the animal parses these things out. So one of our co-authors put together a model, which is actually based on a lot of other pieces of electrophysiological information and so on, and it's been validated quite well. If you're looking at a target and a background, the way that polarization vision works in most of these animals is they have these little parallel arrays of little sort of finger-like projections that have opsin molecules, the things that absorb light, lined up on them. These molecules themselves are dichroic. They follow certain equations for their response, and then they feed in. You get a difference, and then you get a difference over here. And then you piece it again, and then you get a sort of a ratio of these two things. But at any rate, and then the sort of the thresholds for this process is known. And so then we can sort of directly compare the two. A missing piece was thinking about how polarization propagates through the water as you move away from the animal. And so we moved away from degree of polarization and angle of polarization as not very useful constructs for this, and switched over to Stokes vectors, which worked really well. In the end, just worked out after a bunch of math, the equations for what the ranges would be. And what we found out, and there are a lot of different little graphs here, we found out something that actually in the beginning very much upset my co-author. So we had expected, we did this whole process. I mean, I know, science is supposed to be completely neutral and you're supposed to love whatever your answer is, but, in general, you have the hypothesis you really like and the hypothesis that, if it turns out that way, you're not as happy. And we had gone through this whole process, done all these measurements, done all the modeling and so on, to basically, we always said, test whether polarization vision helped seeing silvery animals, but we really wanted to prove it, right? Because that was the cool answer, and that was the thing that everybody would love to hear, and that's what everybody thought, and we were just going to demonstrate it. And the thing to take away from this set of graphs is basically if your data is sitting in this area here, then polarization vision actually helped you. If it's sitting in this triangle here, the sort of purpley ones with this projector, then it did not. Then radiance vision turned out to be better than polarization vision, and adding the polarization vision didn't help. And then we tried a lot of different things with sort of increasing franticness. We only looked at waters that were more polarized. We increased the sensitivity of the polarization detection system. And we allowed the animal to rotate its head to get the actual maximum amount of signal out of the polarization that it possibly could, since it only had a 2-channel polarizer. And in the end, no matter what you did, all the data basically fell in the sort of triangle here that says that polarization vision does not help you. I took this with, I don't know, some sort of Zen whatever. My co-author actually went through sort of the 5 stages of scientific grief. Beginning with disbelief, he just says, it's wrong. And I'm like, why is it wrong? He goes, it's wrong because it's just wrong. And you need to find out what is wrong. And then he became very angry and would scream at my postdoc every day for about an hour or so. And then he went through depression and wouldn't talk to any of us for about 2 months. And then eventually he came around to acceptance and, started to think that, maybe this was okay and worthwhile and all that. So, anybody who thinks science isn't a human process. We tried to figure out why this occurred, and it turned out that when we looked at the underlying data, the degree of linear polarization of the fish actually wasn't so different from that of the background. This line here is the 1-to-1 line. You can see that in general, the fish is a little less polarized than the background. When we looked at the angle of polarization difference between the fish and the background, you can see again it was pretty small. Most of it was actually only a few degrees away. And so then we did some modeling to see, how much will we have to push everything to actually make it start to matter? How could we start pushing things into this side of it? And to do it, we basically had to allow the degree of polarization of the fish to vary randomly and the angle of polarization of the fish to vary randomly. Otherwise, most of the data just always sat down, in this part of the thing. And so it looks like, in this case, at least for maximum detection range polarization vision, it really isn't helping when you're looking at these silvery fish. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is visual costs of schooling. This project actually grew out of a different project where we wanted to figure out why giant squids have such big eyes. Eyes get bigger and bigger and bigger in sort of a continuous fashion in the animal kingdom to get to about the eye of a whale or so that's about 4 inches across. And then there's this giant gap, and then you get eyes of giant squids that are the size of basketballs. And there's just this huge weird area in between where there's nothing. And so we became very interested, why did giant squids and this sort of cousin, the colossal squid, have these basketball-sized eyes and nobody else does? And in the process, we sort of developed a number of theories about how vision works in the water that, in this case, extended to looking at schooling. So, as I mentioned before, the open ocean is a dangerous place. I like to say it's the only place, and you can see it demonstrated here in this photo, where you can be attacked by birds and sharks at the same time. The sharks will come up from below, the birds will come down from above. And the final thing about oceanic predation that's worth knowing is that in certain cases anyway, they will eat a herd, in this case a school, all the way down to nothing. This doesn't always occur, but it happens with alarming frequency. And so this is sort of the equivalent of if you were watching a nature show on the Serengeti Plain and the lions are up on the little bluff with the 2 trees sleeping and all the antelope are out in the field, that one day the lions come down and eat every single antelope, which never happens, right? They come down, they find the sick ones, the small ones, the babies, and they pull them away, and you feel bad because you watch the show and you watch the poor little sick animal die. But in the ocean, and at least in certain cases, they'll just come down and take everyone. It doesn't always occur, but it's more likely to. And so again, open ocean predation is just sort of an evil process. So to maximize your sort of chances in this, there's what's known as the selfish herd principle. And this also, matters for antelopes and things like that. And it's sort of like that old thing, like you don't have to run faster than a bear, you just have to run faster than your friend who's also running from the bear. And in this case, you want to be in a large enough group so that if they don't eat the entire school, that you've lowered your chances of being the one that gets munched. It's kind of sad, but if you're in a group of 1,000, somebody comes down and takes a few of those, your chance is less than if you're a group of 3. And as I mentioned before, the open ocean is not like a coral reef. It's not a refrigerator. It's like walking through a desert. And so when animals show up, they really want to eat as much as they can. And so you want to be in a big group to minimize the chance that, somebody's still hungry by the time they get to you. But the flip side of this is if everybody is thinking of this, and this is where evolution can run into some pretty strange little bottlenecks, everybody's deciding they're a little safer in a larger group, eventually you get really, really big groups. Schools of sardines and such off the coast of Peru can be many, many cubic miles in size. These things can just be enormous. So you're slowly accruing a different cost, which is that maybe once the fish show up, the predators show up, your chance of being eaten has gone down, but the target, the entire size of the group, has become catastrophically large and can be seen from very far away. And so I was interested, what is the balance, between these two forces? Are you better off, just making the thing bigger and bigger and bigger, or, or not? So work with these two folks here. You may actually recognize one of them as your keynote speaker from several years ago, Don Eric Nilsson. He did not show up at that time wearing a strange bonnet. Believe it or not, this is a Swedish thesis defense, and they wear odd costumes when they do them. These are two good buddies of mine, and we worked together on this project. And we tried to do everything possible to maximize the range that things could be seen. And so we included something, animals have an ability called summation, where they can tie together multiple photoreceptors to create a larger pixel. They're losing resolution, but they're gaining signal to noise. And the best case scenario is what is known as dynamic optimal summation, where the target pixel is exactly the width of the target, so that everything in the target pixel is target, and then the background pixel, in this case, is the same size. Everything in the background pixel is background. And this gives you the best chance, because we wanted to maximize the range and maximize the effect of a school getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger on the cost of visibility. So just looking here, you have photons coming in. Of course, you have to deal with the fact that photons are quantum events. It turns out that the dark noise of visual systems is extraordinarily low. And so you can include it, but it doesn't change the results very much at all. And so the primary thing that's limiting, especially once you get a little bit deeper in the water, is just, sort of the random events, random photon events themselves. And so ultimately you're doing something like a t-test. The nice thing is this is a Poisson process, and so the properties of the standard deviation relative to the mean and all that are well known. And so then you're just mostly having to worry about where do all the photons come from. And that means you have to think about what is the sensitivity of the visual system to different wavelengths, what's the aperture, what is the size of the signal at the beginning, and then you have to worry about the attenuation of the signal as you move through the water. And so you need to know a great deal of different pieces going all the way from the signal to the water to the detector to figure out what those photon counts are. But with that, then there's a nice, pretty reasonable theory for sorting out whether something is detectable or not. The biggie you have to worry about, of course, is even in clear water, there's a fair bit of attenuation due to both absorption and scattering, even at the wavelengths that get through the best. And in the end, after all the dust clears, if you don't worry about the internal dark noise, which has no significant effect on the values, you end up with a remarkably simple equation, which is basically that the distance is dependent on the attenuation coefficient of the water, which it really better be dependent on the clarity of the water. Then everything else is inside the Lambert W function, which I'll get to in a second. The things that matter are the contrast of the target, the length of the individual animals in the target. This n value is the number of photons that are actually absorbed by the visual system of the predator, and then this is just the number of animals in the school itself. The Lambert W function, for those of you who don't deal with it much, it's the inverse of x e to the x. And so when x is pretty small, it's a relatively linear function. When x is pretty large, it ends up being rises quite slowly, this inverse. And it's just some of the underlying data that went into it, which is the beam attenuation coefficient, which we measured as a function of depth, and then the actual photon counts for different kind of predators and so on. And then this is what we get, which surprised us to some extent. The top is where we just do the model that we had above. The bottom is where it's restricted a bit more in that the contrast threshold of the viewer can't drop arbitrarily low. There are things that limit it, and it really can't get below about 1%. And so here we sort of have it set up so that it really can't drop below 1%. And then these are the contrasts of the fish, in the school, going up Weber contrast, so, one just twice as bright as the background. And then you have the number of fish in the school. This is a log axis going up pretty quickly. And then depth. And the main thing to take away from this thing is that you're going from pretty small schools to relatively large ones, but the sighting distance is really not changing much at all. So the bottom line, the take-home story of this is that there's really actually very little cost to adding animals to this school, at least in this habitat where you have, a fair bit of attenuation. And the way to think of this is that in most waters, something can be extraordinarily large, and then attenuation is going to chew up your ability to see it at a certain distance. And after that size, increasing, the size of this thing doesn't matter. The way we sometimes describe it is you can be scuba diving 100 meters off, Mauna Loa, the volcano that makes up the big island of Hawaii, and not see it, just because attenuation is won out in this case. And this just sort of this is actually more left in for biological audiences, just sort of like parse out an equation, just showing you what matters. But the thing I wanted to get to last, sort of the last part of this, is that there's only one thing that's sort of inside and outside this Lambert W function, which creates a lot of sort of odd results, which made us think that, changing the clarity of the medium might matter a lot. And so we started also thinking about what's going on in the equivalent of the pelagic world, which is the sky, where you're dealing with, giant swarms of birds or locusts and so on, and these big things. Again, what's sort of the distance at which you can see these large things, and, how does that affect? And then things do get kind of funny and interesting when you have clear air and so on. Generally, the cost is entirely geometric. So this is the ratio of how far you can see something that has 10,000 times as many individuals, as 1,000 times as many individuals as before. And then, if you're basically growing a sphere, that should be 10 if geometry is the only thing that matters. You can see, in these clear areas, geometry is indeed the only thing that matters. But when you're back in the water here, you can see that in brightly lit waters, then, it hardly matters at all. There's hardly any cost at all to becoming bigger. But it does start to matter as you get to like lower and lower light levels. And with that, I just wanted to sort of thank you for your time, say that this field is really ripe and open for people like yourselves to step into it. Like I said, most of the math and things in here were really quite simple and straightforward. Some of the things I've seen here today would be really amazing to apply to issues of, biophotonics in animals, visual ecology, and there's just a tremendous number of fascinating imaging systems in animals that, could be explored. And thanks for your time. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Excellent talk.
Oh, thanks.
Really, really loved it. I was just wondering if maybe just to try to build a little bit of intuition about the last detectability sort of equation. Mm-hmm. Is part of what's going on that the schools can occupy a volume, which means that, but really you only see light that's reflected off of just the 2D surface, and that's part of what's helping out the problem? In the sense that, like, if the school happened to be just planar in a direction that was perpendicular to the view, I assume that would be less favorable.
Yes, this is assuming a spherical school as it grows, which is actually roughly pretty common. So we looked actually at, just for fun, looked at prolate and oblate spheroids, and then included the fact that they should be viewed from all possible directions. In other words, you don't know, and so looked at the average projected area of a oblate and prolate spheroid. And there's actually a really cool topological theorem that the average projected area of a convex solid is 1/4 of its surface area. Which I always loved. It's just one of these magical things that comes out. And so it allows you to analyze it a little bit more easily. In those cases, unless things, as long as you assume a random orientation of the school relative to the viewer, you get basically the same result. Now, if it grows as a plane in all directions and you're viewing perpendicularly to that plane, then yes, I mean, things get bad really fast because you've turned a 3D problem into a 2D problem in a sense. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, yes. That is the coolest thing. So that's sort of the canonical story, that the light field is symmetric. And so we got a ship captain to agree to rotate his ship by tiny little degrees at a time to set it up relative to the sun so we could put down a light meter and actually measure the asymmetry and then compare this with, again, with optical models using radiative transfer theory. It is maximal when the sun is at 45 degrees as you go deeper. So in the very shallow water, it's maximal when the sun is about 10 to 20 degrees above the horizon. And then as you go deeper, it's maximal about 45 because as the sun gets lower and lower, you would think, you know, because on land, that's when you get the maximum asymmetry of the horizontal light field. But underwater, because it's such a more diffuse medium and because as the sun drops, less and less of that light actually makes into the water compared to the light from the sky, you get a funny balancing process. But both the measurements and the model showed that most of the time, at most latitudes, the light field is actually fairly asymmetric to a value of about 2 to 3 to 1. And so some animals actually have the potential to deal with this in that their reflectors are alive. So fish reflectors are not alive. They're plates of guanine and they can't change. So a few of them can do some interesting sort of like ventilate, what are they called? Venetian blind thing where they flip them up and down. But cephalopods actually have living Bragg stacks that are under neural control, and they can change both the strength of the reflection and the wavelength of it. And so one thing we'd love to look into is to whether they're actually able to deal with the asymmetry because, you know, sort of on a real-time basis, so it's pretty tricky. Because otherwise the only solution is for the fish to basically face directly towards the sun or away from the sun to balance that asymmetry. And some fish do this. We've been curious if that's the underlying reason. But yeah, the light field outside of the tropics is not generally as symmetrical as people assume. And so one of the other things we're looking at is whether the silvery fish are more common in the tropics than they are at temperate latitudes because the asymmetry is stronger and stronger as you move away from the poles because the sun just doesn't get as high. And that's sort of in progress over the summer. Oh yeah, yeah. So at dawn and dusk, it's interesting because at that point, you know, the sun's gone away and the light field has become actually fairly symmetric again. It's bad. Yeah, like I said, at these, like around Pittsburgh, which is, you know, not very high, which is fairly high in latitude. Most of the time, the light field here underwater would be pretty asymmetric because, you know, the sun doesn't get above 45 degrees that much. You know, most of the day it's 45 or less, except for a few times in the summer. Yes. Yeah, well, there's some of that. So yeah, you get the, you know, change in, so there are two polarization patterns in the ocean. One is inside Snell's window, you know, the part where you can actually see the sky and it's compressed to about, you know, whatever that is, 98 degrees across. And so in the top 10, maybe 20 meters, depending on how still the water is, you see the skylight pattern transformed by that, that squishing event where, you know, you go from a full hemisphere to, you know, about 98 degrees across. And then there's the pattern outside of the Snell's window, which is entirely determined by scattering under the water itself. And then there's not that big an effect of solar elevation. There's some, but it's not nearly as strong. There's a little bit, and people argue about whether it's enough to sort of tell where the sun is and use it for celestial navigation and things of that sort. Yeah. You know, I sometimes get known as the great naysayer of my field because I'm always looking at hypotheses and finding out they weren't quite true. Sometimes people really hate me. So the way I think of this is it's not that it's useless, it's just not useful in the same way we thought. So I like to think of it this way. So if you're on a coral reef and you have a very colorful fish, if you're close up to that fish, the color information can make it potentially more detectable and can also provide information about identity. You know, is this an animal you want to eat? Is it an animal you want to mate? So on and so on. But as you slowly move away from the animal and you want to think about the maximum detection distance, you will always detect that animal by its radiance contrast, not its chromatic contrast. In other words, if you move far away from any animal underwater, it eventually will look like a slightly lighter or darker shade of the background water. It will never keep a chromatic signal and lose its radiance signal first. And so if you're thinking about what determines the maximum sighting distance, which for pelagic animals matters a lot, then polarization does not help you much. If you're thinking about detection on noisier backgrounds and complicated backgrounds and also determining identification, then polarization information, of course, helps because it's additional information.
Speaker again. Thanks.